Can you put any plant inside of your terrarium? Can you just grab any old plant that you see off the streets or some kind of plant that you see at Home Depot and just stick it in a terrarium? Is it okay to do that, and are your plants going to be okay? We're going to answer that question and all those questions in this video. Hey guys, it's Joe here, coming at you with another video from Hermit Garden. And today we're going to talk about what kind of plants you can put in your terrarium and how you can figure out what kind of plants are going to do well in a terrarium. So first things first, I'm going to answer that question right away. You cannot put any single plant in your terrarium. And there's a very specific reason for that. So most plants are adapted, evolved to survive in very specific conditions. And inside of a terrarium is going to be a whole different set of conditions that may or may not be suitable for the plant that you're trying to grow. So if your plant is like used to growing up in the desert or in the Arctic tundra or in the rainforest, those conditions are not always going to be met within your terrarium. And so because of that, not all plants are going to survive in a terrarium environment. And there's also a few other factors that you might want to consider. So another one that you want to think about is what kind of terrarium are you trying to make here? So there's mainly two types of terrariums. There's the open terrarium, where you have, essentially it's like a glass bowl sorts that you have your plants just growing out in the open, exposed to the open air. And those are going to be a different set of conditions than a closed terrarium, which is a terrarium that's growing inside of a completely sealed container. No air can escape, no water gets out. It's all inside of this sealed container. And those two terrariums are going to get you a very different set of growing conditions, which might not be great for the type of plant you're trying to grow. For example, with an open terrarium, you're mainly going to want to stick to plants that prefer more dry, more arid conditions, just because the humidity is going to escape from your terrarium, and it's going to be a little bit lower humidity levels than with a closed terrarium. And with the closed terrarium, since all of that water and humidity is going to be stuck inside the container, the humidity levels are going to be much higher. And so those kind of conditions are only going to be suitable for very specific types of plants. The other condition that you want to consider is what size of container you're trying to grow. So with a closed terrarium, the container is going to be a very limiting factor for the type of plants that can grow inside of your terrarium. So for example, if you're growing like a really tiny, very tiny vial bottle type of terrarium, not all plants are going to be able to grow in there just because of the size restriction and the space restrictions that they're going to be constrained to. So if you imagine like you're trying to plant a redwood tree inside of like this little mason jar, there's no way that's going to work. Obviously, redwood trees grow like hundreds of feet tall, dozens of feet wide in diameter. There's no way that's going to fit inside of a tiny little jar. So that's obviously a really extreme example, but that kind of paints the picture of what I'm trying to talk about here. The size of your container is going to be very limiting for the type of plants you can grow. And if your plant is way too big for the container size that you're using, then it's not going to do so well in those kind of conditions. So another condition that you might want to consider is what kind of, how competitive your plant is going to be. So certain plants really prefer to grow in isolation. They don't like to be around other plants. So a really good example of this is actually succulents. So succulents and cacti, they prefer to grow in isolation. They don't want to have other plants or succulents growing around them because they prefer to grow just by themselves without any other plants competing for the resources. So that's another idea that you want to think about is if those plants are really going to be great if you want a terrarium that has a whole bunch of plants in your container. So for all of those reasons, you're not going to want to just pick any old plant and throw it inside of a terrarium. You want to be very careful about what kind of plants that you're picking before setting up your terrarium. So if you're not really sure what kind of plants you should choose, my recommendation is to just stick to plants that are really tough and can survive in a variety of different conditions. So there's a few plants that I recommend. So first one is ferns. Those are really good. They tend to do well in closed terrariums. Mosses as well, those are also really great for closed terrariums. And you can also think about creeping figs. And so creeping figs are really tough plants. They can grow in both open and closed terrariums, depending on how you set it up. But for the most part, they're going to be pretty hardy and will give you pretty good chances of surviving within your terrarium. And so if you just pick a plant that's really tough, you can feel safe knowing that you're going to have pretty good chances of having a successful terrarium. The other option that you have is to just pick plants that are native to your area. So if you go to a local park, just look around what kind of plants are around there and that roughly fit the size of your terrarium. There's a good chance if you just pick up those plants, add them to your terrarium, you're going to have pretty good chances of being successful there, just because your terrarium is going to be very close to the conditions of your native area. So if your area is really cold, really dry air or something, you just go to your park, identify what kind of plants are in your area. If you can pick up some plants off the ground, dig them out and add them to your terrarium, and you'll have pretty good chances of having a terrarium that does well, just because the conditions are very similar. Ultimately, when it comes down to choosing your plants, you have a lot of freedom here. You can feel free to experiment and try things out. So I know that sounded really scary, like there's only certain plants that fit inside a terrarium and all that, but when it comes down to it, a terrarium is just a hobby. It's something that you do for fun. If it doesn't work out, that's perfectly fine. The good thing about that is you learned your lesson and you learned something new about gardening and building terrariums. So if anything, one thing you want to take away from this video is that you're perfectly free to experiment and try things out on your own. But those are just general guidelines that you want to stick to when you're building a terrarium. So you can pick whatever plants you want, but just be aware that certain conditions might not be suitable for the plants that you're trying to grow, especially if you're trying to put them into a terrarium. So that's pretty much it for this video. Just to recap, there's a number of things you want to watch for. So number one is the conditions of your plants, like what are their native conditions, where do they grow, and you want to consider those factors in relation to your terrarium's conditions, whether it's going to be an open or closed terrarium, and also the size of the container that you're going to use. And ultimately, just feel free to give it a try and see how it works out. That's what I did with my first terrarium. I didn't really know too much about what was going on and just grabbed some native plants in my area, threw them in, and saw how that worked out. And so far I'm finding pretty good success with that, and I'm sure you will too, especially if you're using plants native to your area. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about this, I have a whole blog post on this topic on my website, hermitgarden.com. Be sure to visit that article if you want to learn more. But other than that, thanks for watching. Give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see videos like this one. See you later.